Okay, so thank you very much for joining this panel session today on alternative investment funds and how firms here in the AIFC and the European Union may benefit from the regulatory cooperation arrangements that have been agreed between the AIFC and the European Union. So my name is Gareth Ling, and I'm the Chief Regulatory Officer at the AFSA, responsible for the authorization, financial conduct, prudential and capital markets divisions, and I will be the moderator for this session. We are joined by the following esteemed panel members in the form of Mukhtar Bubayev, Chief Executive Officer at the AFSA, as well as Emmanuel Dumas, Senior Policy Officer at the European Securities and Markets Authority, followed by Christian Hertz, who is Managing Director of the Luxembourg office of the SAN Group, listed on the London Stock Exchange. And last but by no means least, Shulpan Enabaeva, who is the Chief Executive of Skybridge Invest, which is also one of our licensed AIFC participants and fund managers that operate in this market. We will start with each of our panel members saying a few words to be followed by around 20 minutes or so of questions and answers. And if the audience has any questions they wish to ask, please ask them through the chat section of your screens. The session will be in English, and Shulpan will be speaking in Russian, for which there is a translation button at the bottom of your screen if you prefer to use this function. So with that, let me begin by asking Mukhtar, Chief Executive of the AFSA, to say a few words on the background to the AIFC's and the EU's cooperation in the alternative investment funds market. So, Mukhtar.
Thank you, Gareth. Let me begin by saying that, first of all, investment funds are an area of priority for the AIFC. Now, the AIFC's one of their goals is to become an investment hub and for a savings hub for the wealth in the Central Asian region. Now, of course, we know that there are significant investment needs in the region in order to finance economic development, especially now after the pandemic. But also there is already sizable wealth that has accumulated in the region during the last 30 years. And is looking for investment opportunities as well. Now, traditional tools that are used in the region to finance development is direct investments or debt. And we think that the investment funds is a good opportunity to diversify these tools. And we see that there is a growing popularity in using of investment funds in the region. However, they use structures in Europe, Middle East, and Southeast Asia typically. We think in the AIFC there is an opportunity to develop this industry by offering fund structures as well as fund management services. We have designed a comprehensive framework governing collective investment schemes, which include both conventional and alternative investment funds, such as real estate funds, private equity funds, and hedge funds. This year, we're observing a growing number of funds that are being registered in the AIFC. And we believe there is an opportunity for the Central Asian region to use the AIFC as a gateway into a well-established European market, which is important for us because of, first of all, the vast experience of the fund managers that work in the European Union, as well as, of course, the size, the alternative investment fund size in Europe is over 6 trillion euro. In order to achieve that, our investment fund regulation has to be broadly comparable with the European Union's directive on alternative investment fund managers. And last year, the European regulator, ESMA, has undertaken a review of our legislation and approved AFSA as a MOU counterparty. Now, having a formal cooperation arrangements between the regulators is important because it is a precondition for registration and authorization of fund managers in the European Union. Having an MOU with each individual national securities regulator in the European Union member country means that alternative investment fund managers can operate on a cross-border basis, either in that European Union country or in the AFC, in a manner consistent with the applicable laws in those jurisdictions. Both regulators assist each other in enforcement matters in case of breaches by fund managers of the requirements of the IFMD or the applicable law in the AFC. As of today, AFSA has already signed 17 case memorandums of understandings with securities regulators in the European Union member countries such as Austria, Cyprus, Ireland, Malta, and others. These MOUs create the opportunity for the AFC fund managers to manage and market alternative investment funds to professional investors in the European Union. This is a significant opportunity for managers to be established and authorized in the AFC. So let me conclude by making a few practical observations. First of all, our arrangements with the European Union security regulators means that AFC fund managers can market and manage alternative investment funds to professional investors in respective European Union countries, as well as for the EU fund managers to manage and market alternative investment funds in the AFC. Second, in the case of non-EU funds, it is currently only possible that the fund may be managed and marketed within the national private placement regime of the European Union country where authorization is obtained. Third, some of our fund managers are not very big, so it might be interesting for them that the European Union has a lighter regime for smaller and unleveraged funds and smaller fund managers. So such funds may be exempt from authorization and only require registration. So with this, I would like to thank you and just point out that we think that there is a lot of opportunity for the fund managers in the AFC, and we think that this will help us develop the investment in the region. Thank you very much. Gareth, back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Mukhtar, for that very useful overview. If I may turn now to Emmanuel at the ESMA, who will talk more specifically about the EU's AIFM directive and some of its key features.
Many thanks, Gareth, and indeed, I think it's quite a useful link to what was previously mentioned by the previous speaker, because I think it's important to know first what is the IFMD about. In the European Union, the investment management regulatory space is actually governed by two pieces of legislations. First of all, the UCITS directive, which is about investment funds mainly dedicated to retail investors, which are quite safe in the sense that they need daily redemptions. There are limits, concentration limits, rules on portfolio diversifications, which are rather strict. And therefore, you have a lot of rules on these products, which are like a brand in the EU. But next to this, you have the AFM directive. And it's important to mention that the definition of an AIF, that is a fund governed by the AFM directive, is very simple, actually, because it's an investment fund which is not a UCITS, and which is why I was mentioning what is the UCITS directive. This has broad consequences, because it means that you could think when you read the name of this directive that it's only about hedge fund or such type of funds, but actually not at all. An AIF can be, of course, an hedge fund, but it can be also a real estate fund, a private equity fund, and it can even also be what we call a quasi-UCITS, meaning a fund which is actually very close to what a UCITS fund is, that is a fund mainly dedicated to retail investors. But because one of the rules is slightly different, it actually enters into the scope of the IFMD. And it's important to bear in mind this feature of the IFMD because it explains you why the IFM directive does not include many rules on the products themselves, that is on the investment funds, but more on the managers of the AIF. And this is a key feature of the AIFMD. Now, when you've described the scope of this directive, it's interesting to try to see how non-EU funds are treated in this piece of legislation. Actually, under the AIFMD, you have two different ways for a non-EU fund or a non-EU manager to market a fund in the EU or to manage fund in the EU. The first one is what we call the national private placement regimes, which were alluded to by the previous speaker. And in that option, the non-EU fund can be marketed in a single member state, provided this EU member state allows it. But then this non-EU fund cannot be marketed in the other member states, meaning that it's not a mechanism of passport. And it's also important to bear in mind that the prerequisite is precisely the conclusion of this memorandum of understanding, this MOU, that was signed this year in the case of the AFC. And in relation to this MOU, I think it's also important to remember that while the MOU is negotiated by ESMA, it is once agreed at the level of the ESMA Board of Supervisors, then it needs to be signed on a bilateral basis by the different member states, the different national competent authorities, actually. This is a slightly peculiar feature of the regulatory rule, but it's important to bear in mind because it explains you why you have one text, which is commonly agreed at the EU level and with the non-EU authority. But then you have 27 MOUs if all national competent authority would sign. This means also that it might take a bit of time for certain EU NCA to sign this MOU, but it's just normal. It's just how the process goes. So this is the first way. But it's very, very important to bear in mind that the spirit of the AIFMD, when it was agreed on, was actually more to try to go for another way for non-EU fund to be marketed in the EU and for non-EU managers to manage fund in the EU, which was what is called the AIFMD third country passport. So this is, as it's named, a mechanism of passporting, which means that in that option, once the non-EU fund would be authorized by one member state who would be called the home member state, then it could be marketed in the other member states automatically, that is, without further authorizations by the other EU member states. And this mechanism is, of course, very important for non-EU countries and also for EU investors, but it's not activated yet. It's not activated yet. It's key to understand that the prerequisite, of course, is to have an MOU with the non-EU country, but there are also other conditions to be fulfilled in. And these conditions are mainly that ESMA has to give a positive advice to the co-legislator, to the Commission in particular, on the extent to which this passport should be granted to a certain non-EU country. And provided ESMA has given this positive advice, the Commission may then activate the passport for one or several non-EU countries. And ESMA has actually already provided its advice to the Commission on the first batch of non-EU countries. And this was actually back in 2016. If you look on the internet. You'll find it. It's an advice dated September 2016, and it covered 12 non-EU countries. Of course, ESMA has to look at various criteria to assess these non-EU countries. But following this advice, the Commission has not activated yet the passport, which is why currently you don't have an IFMD passport. But given the new political situation in the EU, now that the Brexit has become clearer, you may expect that this passport might at some point in the future be activated. And therefore I'm mentioning this because it would be indeed for non-EU countries and for us as well a very important element in the strategy to develop in the EU. And I think I will stop there, Gareth. Of course, feel free to ask any questions if anything was unclear. Many thanks.
Okay, no, certainly. Thank you, Emmanuel, for that insight into how these cooperation arrangements actually come to life. And we'll definitely come back to you later with some more questions. So let me now ask Christian from the Luxembourg office of SAN Group to give us the perspective of how firms in the European Union may benefit further from these arrangements.
Yes, thanks, Gareth. And actually, we talked about the national private placement regimes. We talked about the future potential passport for third countries. But the reality is that AIFMD has been out for 10 years, and there are many fund initiators from outside the European Union which benefit from the European passport today. What you need if you want to benefit from the AIFMD passport today as an initiator and manager of a fund in your country, you need a European fund and you need a fund manager in Europe. You need a fund in Europe, then where are you going to set up your fund in Europe, where it all depends on your investors. If you target mainly a specific country like France, for instance, you should set up your fund in France because French investors love French funds. If you want to go to a more diversified source of investors, you may wish to go to a more recognized international fund center. I mean, it's not because I work in Luxembourg that I will say that Luxembourg is the largest center for fund domiciliation in Europe. It's just the contrary. I work in Luxembourg because Luxembourg is the largest fund center for domiciliation. That's it for the funds. And you need a fund manager in Europe. So as an initiator, you have two solutions. You may wish to set up your own operation in Europe, or you may to hire an existing fund manager in order to act as fund manager for your fund. In the first case, it's a dedication to true operations in Europe. You need to have your own staff, your own premises, your own system, and be regulated on an ongoing basis by a local manager. And it's very relevant for the largest managers in the globe who have decided to have operations in Europe. But usually that's for the billion plus of AUM. The other solution is more to go for a fund manager, so-called third-party fund manager, which is by contrast more a plug-and-play solution, where you will have your fund, which will appoint your European fund manager, and your European fund manager will appoint you as investment advisor or delegate portfolio manager. And in this case, you will continue to do the sourcing of investment opportunities consistent with the investment strategy that you will have described in your fund. And then you will present these investment opportunities as investment recommendations to your European fund manager. The European fund manager will review, and once it's satisfied that the investment or divestment opportunities you are presenting are suitable to the fund, they will make the investment or divestment decision. And of course, you can decide to go step by step, to go and test Europe by fund manager for hire or third party fund manager. And once you're happy and it has developed, or for your successor fund, you may decide to set up your own operations. It's important for all your members to know this, because I would say the vast majority of funds set up in Europe are actually initiated by non-EU initiators. So the passport is already available to you if you have a good strategy and you have tested the interest of the European market to go for there. I'll stop there, Gareth. I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Christian. Good. So, and then just to complete these perspectives, let's go over to Shulpan, CEO of Skybridge Invest, who will share her feedback from the perspective of an AIFC licensed fund manager. Shulpan.
Good morning, good afternoon. I thank the previous speakers. I have received a lot of useful information. We are a licensed managing company in AIFC, and we already have experience in managing the fund. We've been in AIFC for over 1 year, and right now our plan is to create the whole line of funds, including the alternative investment funds, with non-standard investment strategies into shares and bonds, and also real estate venture projects. Furthermore, we have interesting plans and ideas to invest into art and musical instruments. And in this regard, for us, the conditions created in Astana International Financial Center are very attractive, in a sense that it has flexibility and it's committed to international standards in the way they regulate the activities. So in the framework of the standard regulation in the Republic of Kazakhstan, those investment ideas would not have been possible. And during today's session, I have already learned a lot of useful things about the opportunities provided by participation under the EU directive. And for us, it's quite interesting because we have recently completed actually our registration process for a fund in Luxembourg, and we have a positive outlook towards cooperation with European markets. So we'll look further into opportunities provided under the EU directive. So I guess I have nothing more to say. I've actually learned more today than I can share from my side. We are just starting our work on alternative investments, but I could say that probably among the Kazakhstani players, we are the most advanced because we are looking into that direction. And as Mr. Bobeyev has mentioned, I can confirm that indeed that there is experience and indeed there is wealth accumulated in the country, and they are now looking for alternative ways to invest that wealth. And I think it will be quite interesting to look into interesting investment opportunities. Maybe we could look into some unusual alternatives of maybe collective ownership of some unique musical instruments to support then young, unique talents, or the opportunities to pass on the wealth to the future generations. There are also ideas on how to search for startups, for IPOs. So I think that we have the necessary expertise to select these projects. And also we are thinking about creating a venture fund that would invest into projects like this. And AIFC gives us these opportunities to create funds like that with different types of instruments, with various types of funds, the duration of the funds. And we consider that this cooperation with the EU is a positive element, because when we are looking for some new things to implement in Kazakhstan, sometimes we don't need to reinvent the wheel, and we rather should look towards the existing European markets with its long-standing traditions. And many of the investment ideas could be actually borrowed from there, from the classical, well-developed markets and renowned centers working with the funds. And that's all I had. Thank you. I probably cannot contribute much to the discussion, but I'm learning a lot.
Mm. Okay, great. No, thank you very much, Chopin, for completing these 4 overviews from our panelists. And I'm very interested and very pleased to hear that you've managed to register a fund in Luxembourg. So this is real and this is happening. So that's really good to hear. So okay, so I'll keep an eye on the chat, but in terms of our questions, I think what we'll do is let me start by asking Mukhtar a question first in terms of how do you see the potential for the AIFC to become an asset management hub in the Eurasia region?
Thank you, Gareth. Maybe as a regulator, I have to be more conservative, but actually I think we have a very promising opportunity for the AIFC to become the fund management hub for the Eurasian region. There are 4 angles to this belief. First of all, because of this natural location. So we're geographically positioned and we can take advantage of this geographical position. We're right in the center of the Eurasian region. So it's very easy for investors to access our center, which is now becoming more important with the pandemic and the travel restrictions, especially. Second is law. So we're English-based common law jurisdiction, but also our commercial law and our financial regulation is comprehensive, as well as very similar to what you can find in other jurisdictions where the funds industry is growing. So this, I think, is our advantage. Third is the tax framework. Now it's the tax is quite liberal on the fund managers as well as the funds themselves. And the fourth angle is the international recognition, and this is something we as Astana Financial Services Authority are paying a lot of attention to and devoting a lot of our time. So in order for us to become a gateway to other jurisdictions, as well as to become internationally recognized. So I think we will continue in AIFC to develop in, well, if not geographical, but at least the 3 other angles. And this will support the development of the fund management industry here in the AIFC. Thank you, Gary.
All right, good. No, thank you. Okay, so let me ask a question of Emmanuel now. So in terms of the granting of AIFM directive passports to third countries, i.e. non-EU countries, how does the ESMA select the countries to be assessed and then determine whether they can be granted the AIFM passport?
Yeah, thank you, Gareth. I think it's an interesting question indeed, because it also relates to what Christian mentioned just before. First of all, I think that indeed, if you want to establish a fund in the EU and establish yourself as an EU manager, indeed, I had not mentioned this, but as in the UCITS directive, of course, the IFMD includes what we call an EU passport, and therefore, in that context, you may benefit from all the advantages of this passport if you are able to establish this type of arrangement. But I think it's important to understand the nuance with the national private placement regime and the third country passport. Because indeed, how would we select the non-EU countries to be granted the IFMD passport? How have we done in the September 2016 advice? Well, very simply, we have looked at the statistics of national private placement regimes, meaning that we have looked what were the main non-EU jurisdictions represented in terms of national placement regime, whether it's on funds or managers. And for those non-EU countries that had a significant market share here, we have pre-selected them as non-EU countries to be potentially granted the IFMD third country passport. So that means that, of course, if you don't use at all the national private placement regime, you are less in a position to be granted the IFMD passport. But that's only a prerequisite, precondition, because we have a lot of non-EU countries, and it takes a lot of time to assess each and every country to be granted the IFMD passports. And this is because the conditions which are specified in the IFMD include not only investor protection, that is, how does the regulatory framework in the non-EU country compare to the IFMD? And for those who already had a look at the IFMD, it's a huge piece of legislation. So trying to assess how the non-EU country legislation compared to this is quite something. But in addition to this, we also have to look into competition-related issues between the EU member states and the non-EU country that we would assess. Which means that there's an entire methodology, which is, by the way, described in the September advice. But the outcome of this is that we have pre-selected at that time something like 15 or 20 non-EU countries. And out of this, we granted the passport to almost 12, with some conditions, for example, on competition-related matters for some of them. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, that's interesting. So can you just give us an example of some of the countries that you have granted the passport to?
Sure. So I think that there were, I would say, different type of non-EU countries. The first type was, I would say, the big non-EU countries with a very big market share. So, for example, the US or Japan, Australia, Canada. For those non-EU countries, it was really the size of the market and the interaction already existing with the EU member states, which were taken into account in addition to the comparability of the regulatory framework. So these countries were positively advised with, of course, some conditions. For example, in the case of the US, as you may imagine. And then you had another type of non-EU countries, which were smaller non-EU countries, but which were of places where you had already a lot of interaction. For example, Jersey, Guernsey, places where they had already set up what we call IFMD-like regulatory framework, that is a piece of legislation which actually mirror very closely the IFMD, and therefore in our assessment this is an important point. And yes, that was mainly these two broad categories.
Okay. And is the UK one of these yet? Yeah.
So of course, when we conducted this work, the UK was still in the EU, so it could not be part of that advice. But then following the long negotiation that you may have seen, it turns that there is a specific MMOU with the UK, which covers actually various pieces of legislation, not only the IFMD, but that includes the IFMD in the sense that this MMOU plays the role of an IFMD MOU for the purpose of the investment management space. But it doesn't mean that the UK benefits from the non-EU IFMD passport, since it has not been activated for any country at the moment. But we would have, I guess, to assess the UK as other non-EU countries in that context.
All right, good, thank you. Okay, let me turn to Christian. So you talked about fund domiciles and fund managers' options. What other services or functions would they need to select to set up a fund in Europe?
Yeah, thank you, Gareth. And that echoes to what Emmanuel just said, that the AIFMD framework, similar to the UCITS framework, is a very demanding framework. So you have a certain number of investment protection, mainly concerns which have been addressed in these directives. So as you just mentioned, the main actor is the fund manager, which is in charge of portfolio management, risk management, valuation, and distribution usually. The second most important actor is the depository, and the depository is essentially here to make sure that the assets are actually held by the fund on behalf and for the benefit of the investors. So they are a bit controlling each other, the fund manager and the depository, and that's why they need to be ring-fenced, and you will need to choose a depository on top of your fund manager. And of course, you will need also somebody to do the accounting and the registrar agent for the fund, so the administrator, which may be a third party, or which may be part of the fund manager or part of the depository. These are the three key elements. As satellite, you also, of course, will need to appoint an auditor for your fund, and usually a fund lawyer, in order to draft and check the fund documents. So that's basically the main service providers you'll need to select when you do an RFP. I'm very happy to have heard just before that we have a Kazakh fund manager having gone through the exercise and being able to make a testimony that this is feasible. Actually, it's feasible to go through all this to launch successfully. We hope great success. I mean, it's been more than 3 years since I last was in Kazakhstan, but next time I'll certainly visit the fund center to see and test and offer more if there are more interest for Europe and Lux.
No, definitely, and I can say personally that there has been many more queries we've had in the last quarter. So there's a lot of interest. We're answering a lot of questions and having dealing with a lot of potential participants. So okay. You mentioned administrator then. Are there any particular requirements as to where the administrator would have to be?
So under AIFMD, you just need the administrator to be able to conduct fair valuation on the assets on a frequency to be determined by each fund, no less than once a year, but then you have daily funds, as Emmanuel said, for UCITS, and you have a yearly NAV for the less liquid strategies, and in between you have everything, basically.
Yeah, okay. And then what are the conditions, what are the requirements or conditions for a European fund to then invest outside of Europe?
Well, there are almost no conditions. A European fund can invest as long as it's in line with its investment strategy. It can invest more or less in any assets and everywhere. Of course, and we've not talked about that, but anti-money laundering is a big focus in the financial markets worldwide and in Europe particularly. So that would be, in my view, the main limit to be able to invest everywhere and anywhere. That's to be able to collect and present a properly built AML file. Otherwise, your European fund will not be able to invest.
Okay, good. No, thank you very much. So let me ask a couple of questions of Shulpan. So, and I know you've touched on some of the areas that you're looking at. Fine art, I'm quite interested in, or musical instruments. But can you tell us about any other plans of Skybridge Invest to invest in relation to creating and promoting alternative investment funds? Any other particular sectors you are looking at?
We have standard funds that we manage using the trade. In fact, the fund that we registered in Luxembourg is based on use of the algorithm and risk parity, and would bring quite an interesting rate of return for Europeans at the level of 14% in hard currency. And I think it's going to be quite an exciting instrument, and we're going to promote it. As for the alternative investments, we have a vision to establish the real estate fund, and it will not be the real estate fund that would only get the rental payments. The way we see it is also as the real estate, as the growth of real estate. For this purpose, the company is now establishing the analytical function that will analyze the trends on changes to the real estate globally, so that it would be able to choose the best objects for investments in the countries where we see it could be of a benefit. In addition, I also mentioned the possibility of creating a venture fund, for which we are preparing, and we are now developing the offer materials, which will submit for registration in AFSA. In our investment strategy, we are considering both direct investments in the projects that we plan to have a longer duration and probably to be involved in the management. So it could be for 1, 2, or 3 years, depending on the development of the company. And we are also considering the search for the interesting pre-IPO history. Our analytical team has a clear expertise as to when we chose the successful pre-IPO stories, and the duration here would be shorter, up to 1 year or half year. We are going to choose the instruments for that, and these instruments will be included in the investment strategy of the venture fund. At the same time, we do not limit ourselves regarding the projects by CIS or Central Asian countries. We are seeking for them globally. In addition, this nice idea about the fund for investing into the musical instruments, in fact, we are one of the sponsors of Almaty Philharmonic. We are having very good relations with our music institution, and in fact we are aware that there is a need to support the young talents, and this is a few of our ideas that we are now considering. And even out of these 3 ideas, if we are successful to issue them and to launch them within 1 year, it's going to be a big breakthrough for us. These are our ideas: the real estate fund, venture fund, and the kind of the sponsorship.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. Thank you. So you mentioned 14% as an example of one level of return. Is that consistent with the level of returns you might generally expect from alternative investment funds?
No. I was telling this 14% is the strategy that we are planning for the fund by AIFC, and the same strategy is included in the Sky Adamant Fund strategy that was registered in Luxembourg. And this fund is not the fund for alternative investments. This is a classical investment into IDF with risk control, whereby the algorithm defines the share of a particular instrument, and it's not done manually, but rather automatically.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much. Good. So I think probably need to start to draw things to a close. So I thought we'd give 1 minute to each panel member on what their key takeaway messages are for the audience, starting this time in reverse order. So Chopin, your key takeaway for the audience. Yeah.
The key takeaway for us would be that we would look with optimism into our cooperation with the International Financial Center of Astana, where the comfortable and convenient conditions are established to create funds with great diversification based on strategies, and the fact that AIFC now
на самом деле открывает возможности как для демонстрации наших стратегий европейским инвесторам, так и для поиска иностранных инвесторов для казахстанских проектов, так и, в принципе, как бы для поиска проектов в Европе.
Could help searching for projects in Europe for all the Kazakhstani investors. So we'll look at all these initiatives with great optimism. So I hope that we will expand our presence here.
Okay, no, great. So basically, be optimistic about these arrangements, and all fund managers should not be afraid to go down that path and go through the process that they need to. And Christian, just briefly in no more than 1 minute, if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you have a good strategy, as you said, you have tested some European investors, you see there is interest, then you should really consider taking advantage of the European passport by setting a fund in Europe, and keeping in mind that there are a number of institutional investors in Europe who can only invest in AIFMD compliant funds, or at least can invest more in AIFMD compliant funds. So it will help your marketing, definitely your fundraising, if you have a European fund and you can market it under the marketing passport.
Okay, great. And Emmanuel, key takeaways?
Yes, many thanks, Gareth. I think that with today's discussion, people, I think, must have heard that there are various ways actually to market or manage fund in the EU, whether you take advantage of what Christian described or what I've described in my part. But there's one point I should highlight, which is that, the signature of an MOU in the area before COVID was much easier, because once the agreement was agreed at ESMA, you had 27 chairs of the 27 EU authorities who would be sitting around the same table, signing at the same time the MOU, and then send back to the non-EU authority. Of course, that was not possible this year, given the remote environment that we are all living with. But in spite of this, as was mentioned before, you have already 17 MOUs signed. So I think it's a great achievement that I wanted to highlight. Really well done. That was not so easy. And I think that this shows the involvement of everyone in this fight. And that would be my last word. Yeah, thank you.
All right, great. Well, my thanks to the panel today and to the audience for their attention. And I hope this session has provided some useful insights. So let me just give the very final 10 seconds to Mukhtar, your key takeaway.
Thank you, Gareth. So 10 seconds. AFC is the place to do your fund management or to establish funds here in the Eurasian region. But we will continue to focus on our relationship with the European Union. We've heard there's a lot of opportunity with the national placement regime, maybe going forward with the AFMD passporting for third countries. So we'll continue this cooperation. And I think this will be for mutual benefit of everyone. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And 25 seconds over, and we haven't been cut off yet. So just about got it in there. So thank you. Right. Thank you, Emmanuel, Chopin, and Christian.